Welcome, everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We're so glad to have you here with us today. We're going to be speaking about labor and farm-to-institution supply chains. This is FINE's second webinar in this series, and we'll be talking about incorporating worker values into local food procurement. Thanks for joining us. My name is Tania Taranovski. I'm FINE's Director of Programs, and I'm really thrilled to be hosting this webinar today. So glad you could all join us. Also helping out is Britt Florio, also from FINE. She's going to be moderating the chat, and if you come across any technical difficulties, you can message her. She'll give you a hand. You'll see her adding some links and helpful resources into the chat as well. As I said, today's webinar is FINE's second in a series, which is seeking to address labor inequities and abuses in our regional food system. Our first webinar in this series was in the fall, and it was with reporter Claire Brown of The Counter. And she looked at how prisons are being used as a labor source to produce food for private companies and public institutions. And she offered resources for institutions to assess and address these potential issues in their own supply chains. You can find this webinar and all of our previous webinars and other recordings on FINE's YouTube channel. You can also find more information related to labor issues and farm to institution in FINE's resource database. So we welcome you to contribute also any information you may have that you think that would be useful for us to share there. I'd like to just take a moment to note that we're recording today's webinar so that we can share it with folks afterwards. We'll post it online and it'll be shared with all who registered, so anyone who misses it today will be able to watch. We're also planning to create a Spanish language version of this webinar, which will be also available online. I'm sharing right now a brief outline for today's forum. So after this introduction, I'm going to hand things over to our speakers, and we're going to make sure that we leave time for questions and answers. At the end of the webinar, we hope you'll take a minute to answer our very brief survey. It really helps us to think about what other kind of content we can provide that would be useful, and to learn more about what you're all working on in the farm to institution world and in the food system as well. So thank you for that. I'm going to also just remind you really quickly about two interactive features that we'll be using today. If you look at your little Zoom toolbar toward the bottom of the screen, you'll see the chat, and you can open the chat box to share comments or other information with all the folks who are attending the webinar today. If you want to take a moment just to introduce yourself, that would be great. We'd love to see your name, your organization, if you want to share those, and if you'd like how you or your organization are centering and addressing workers' rights and perspectives in our food system. And if there's any other resources you want to share, we welcome them there as well. You'll also see a Q&A button, and you can, at any time, you can go ahead and put your questions into that, and then we'll answer them in the Q&A section of the webinar towards the end. Now, before I introduce our speakers, I'd just briefly like to tell you a little bit about FINE. We're a cross-sector network backbone organization working to mobilize the power of New England institutions to transform our food system. And we are really interested in promoting and achieving the New England food vision. We're working actively with K-12 schools, colleges and universities, hospitals, prisons and jails, and we have a new initiative which partners with folks in the early childcare education sector. So for more information about FINE, we hope you'll visit our website. And I also just want to take a moment to share a little bit about our campus work because a lot of these webinars arise from that effort. We're supporters of the New England Farm and Sea to Campus Network, and the network is a community of higher education and food system stakeholders who are looking to develop transparent regional supply chains and to educate campus communities about regional food systems. The webinars are just one of the ways that we convene around key issues in our food system, and so we're glad that you could join us today. When many of us think about farm to institution, we're focusing on where the food is coming from, but just as important is how it was produced. And today we're going to focus on who is involved in that food production. With that, I'd like to say a special thank you to Minyo Mulugeta, who is currently a master's student at University of Vermont, but she worked with FINE over the summer, and she brought her passion for issues around labor into our work. And she developed webinars and a blog on labor issues on farm to institution. And we're really grateful to her for her efforts. And thanks also to Farm and Sea to Campus Network Steering Committee for participating and supporting this work. So with that, today I am really pleased to welcome our speakers, Rafaela Rodriguez from the Worker-Driven Social Responsibility Network. They've been a great resource to us as we've been thinking about these issues, and I'm really pleased to have them joining us today. Rafaela is going to tell us more about the worker-driven social responsibility model, which is based upon empowering workers to protect and enforce their rights and ensuring that worker organizations drive initiatives that are monitored and enforceable. We're sharing some helpful links in the chat so you can continue to learn and find resources about worker-driven social responsibility. Rafaela has spent years as an organizer and advocate alongside human trafficking survivors, migrants, and undocumented communities, both in the US and abroad. Welcome, Rafaela. And I'm also really pleased to welcome Enrique Balcazar. Enrique is an organizer with Migrant Justice. Migrant Justice is a grassroots community organization founded and led by the migrant farm worker community in Vermont. Enrique is going to be speaking in Spanish, and his colleague from Migrant Justice, Madeline, is going to provide English interpretation for those of us who need that service. So welcome also to Enrique and to Madeline. So thank you all for joining us. I'm now going to turn things over to Rafaela, our first speaker.
Thank you, Tania and Fine, for having us today, presenting on the work we do to defend and protect workers. Yeah, I also wanted to mention that before working for the network, I worked as an auditor in Vermont for the Milk with Dignity Standards Council, one of the worker-driven programs being implemented in the Northeast. Next slide. The WSR model has been implemented before that. Sorry.
Next one.
No, just go before 2. I think you just skipped to 2 more. I think you're going forward.
Oh, I'm going backwards, sorry.
Yeah. Back a couple more. There we go. There we go. It's okay. As I was saying, the WSR model has been implemented across different industries and has been recognized as the gold standard for eradicating modern day slavery from agricultural fields to garment factories, protecting workers from abuse, violence, and improving daily conditions in some of the worst labor industries in the world. Next slide. After the success of the model in Immokalee, Florida, by the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, as well as in the garment industry in Bangladesh through the Accord, a group of interested and invested organizations came together to create the network. It was thought of as a place where workers and their allies could come together and support each other in spreading this model and debunking models that fail workers. Next one. This model has been successful due to its commitment to the WSR principles, which are non-negotiable and need to be implemented together. If a program is to improve workers' day-to-day realities, workers must be at the head of the table in creating and implementing the program. This means that workers are the drivers of its design, its monitoring, and its enforcement. This includes worker-to-worker education, where workers are informed about their rights under the program and how to enforce those rights. They are also the ones who write what we call the code of conduct, which is a set of rights or standards that are specific to the work that they do and informed by their experiences as workers. Lastly, it is critical that in order to have workers successfully report abuses, there is strict protection from retaliation. Next slide. This might sound obvious, but solutions cannot be optional or voluntary. Effective enforcement is key to the success of any social responsibility program, and WSR programs are legally binding, which means that corporations sign an agreement that outlines these principles and commits them to using their market power to incentivize employers as well as suppliers to comply with that code of conduct and to improve conditions over time. In the day-to-day implementation of these programs, this means that if an employer refuses to comply or has committed a serious violation that they're not willing to fix, there are actual consequences for those violations. It's important to also remember that companies sign agreements all the time, whether that is to certify their supply chain or guarantee sourcing of a material. They just often do not want to sign something that commits them to honoring the lives of workers in their supply chain. Next slide. The financial incentive to comply. What we recognize is that corporations at the top of supply chains place constant price pressure on their suppliers, which translates into downward pressure on wages and labor conditions. The market incentivizes abuse. Corporations must instead be required to incentivize respect for human rights through a price premium or other financial support that enables suppliers to afford the additional cost of compliance with the agreed labor standards. Next slide. As I mentioned before, there must be meaningful, swift, and certain economic consequences for suppliers and employers that violate their workers' human rights. Only programs that include such economic consequences can ensure protection for workers. Next one. Measurable and timely. Suppliers must be given specific timeframes to remediate an issue. This ensures accountability and sends a message to workers. That message says that this program is listening to the concerns you are raising as a worker, and you will see the results of you raising your voice and advocating for yourself. Unfortunately, current legal frameworks are excruciatingly slow, and workers might not see the benefit of their advocacy for years to come. Next slide. Monitoring. Effective monitoring of supplier compliance is essential and must include auditors who have deep knowledge of the relevant industry and labor issues. Auditors must be local to the community and cannot parachute in on a yearly basis to go over a checklist of standards. There must be in-depth worker interviews carried out under conditions where workers can speak freely. WSR programs also include a 24-hour support line where workers can call in their native language with any issues and be guaranteed remediation. It is also critical that they operate independently of financial control and influence by corporations. Next slide. As of today, there are 2 national programs and 2 international programs. There's the Fair Food Program, started in 2011, which is now in 7 states and different crops. There are 14 brands who have signed that agreement. There is the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh, which was implemented in 2013 after the catastrophic collapse of the Rana Plaza in Dhaka, where over 1,000 workers died, days after just being audited for safety standards. And the accord was successfully renewed last year with over 150 brand signatories. The newest of the programs is in Lesotho, where women have successfully organized to stop gender-based violence in jean factories. And now I will let my colleague Enrique Balcazar, a staff with Migrant Justice, tell us more about the Milk with Dignity program, which is the 2nd national WSR program and the first worker-led solution to abuses in the dairy industry.
I'm just gonna share screen.
¿Nos pueden escuchar?
Sí, yo sí te escucho, Enrique.
Gracias, Rafa. Sí, muchísimas gracias, Rafa. Pues nos presentamos rápido. Mi nombre es Enrique Balcazar. Soy parte de la comunidad migrante. He sido trabajador lechero aquí en el estado de Vermont y ahora organizador con Justicia Migrante.
So to introduce myself briefly, my name is Enrique Balcazar. I'm part of the migrant farm worker community here in Vermont. I was a dairy farm worker, and right now I'm an organizer with Migrant Justice. And my name is Madeline. I'm here. I'm going to be interpreting from Spanish to English.
Sí, y bueno, estoy muy emocionado por compartir en esta presentación, que también formamos parte, ¿verdad?, del modelo WSR que nos presentaba Rafa. Entonces, Justicia Migrante, pues somos una organización de base de trabajadores lecheros, la cual pues se está organizando, ¿verdad? Y también llama a aliados para formar parte, para también tomar acción junto a nosotros, liderados por nosotros, para los derechos humanos y una economía justa.
So I'm really excited to share. It's exciting. We're here, as Rafaela mentioned, as part of the WSR model. And to explain, Migrant Justice is a grassroots organization founded and led by dairy farm workers. We are organizing in Vermont and also calling on allies to take action led by farm workers towards human rights and economic justice.
Justicia Migrante, un poquito de la historia, ¿verdad? Justicia Migrante comenzó hace 10 años después de una tragedia, la muerte de un compañero llamado José Obed, quien murió en un rancho estrangulado con su ropa después de ser jalado por una maquinaria vieja. Esto fue lo que reveló una comunidad invisible en el estado de Vermont, los cuales somos alrededor de 1,000 trabajadores ayudando a sostener la industria lechera.
So to share a little bit of history about Migrant Justice, the organization began about 10 years ago after a tragedy where a young farm worker named Jose Obed died in an accident on a farm. He was strangled to death by an old piece of machinery at work. And this tragedy revealed a community that had been invisibilized, where there are about 1,000 farm workers, immigrant farm workers sustaining the dairy farm industry in Vermont.
Y bueno, esto fue, la muerte de José Obed fue la chispa para empezarnos a organizar y salir de las sombras. La comunidad empezamos a juntarnos, a hacer reuniones, sí, para convivir, pero también para hablar de los problemas en común que estábamos enfrentando en el lugar de trabajo y la vida en Vermont.
This tragedy became a spark for our community to start to get organized. We began to come out of the shadows to get together and meet and identify common problems.
Sí, y de ahí es donde nacen las campañas que tenemos Justicia Migrante y las cuales, bueno, uno de los objetivos principales siempre ha sido el enfoque por los derechos de trabajos justos y las viviendas dignas.
And so out of those spaces are where the campaigns for migrant justice have been born. And among many, we've always maintained a strong focus on the right to dignified work and just housing.
Y es que somos casi el 80 o 90% de la comunidad, bueno, los que sostenemos la industria lechera, ¿verdad? El 80 o 90% de los trabajadores somos inmigrantes. Entonces, y trabajamos todo el año. La lechería es un trabajo de todo el año. Los ranchos, ¿verdad? Son pequeños y mayormente aislados e invisibles.
And so of the farm workers in Vermont sustaining the dairy industry, about 80 to 90% are immigrant workers. We work all year round, and in Vermont, the dairy farms tend to be fairly small and a lot of times in very isolated locations.
Justicia Migrante, hemos liderado ya 2 encuestas para aprender más de los problemas que enfrenta nuestra comunidad de trabajadores lecheros, en la cuales hemos aprendido, ¿verdad?, que muchos de los trabajadores en la industria lechera ganamos menos del salario mínimo del estado. Trabajamos 60 a 80 horas a la semana y muchas veces en un día de descanso.
We've led 2 worker-to-worker surveys to better understand the problems that our community is facing. And through that, we've learned that many farm workers are making less than the state minimum wage, that many people are working between 70 and 80 hours a week, and in many cases without even one day off.
También vivimos donde trabajamos y trabajamos donde vivimos, ¿verdad? Las viviendas muchas veces son en malas condiciones, viejas, 2 o 3 compañeros por cuarto, a veces varios casos sin agua potable o calefacción.
We live where we work and we work where we live. And so housing has also been a big issue. Undignified conditions, old, overcrowded housing, sometimes 2 to 3 people sharing a room, and even some houses without suitable drinking water or proper heat.
También altos porcentajes de accidentes con los químicos, con la maquinaria, con los animales, ¿verdad? Por falta de equipo de protección y acceso al cuidado de salud.
And we see a really high percentage rate of accidents, people working with dangerous chemicals, machinery, large animals, without the access to labor protections and healthcare.
Y bueno, así muchos más problemas que existen en la industria lechera.
And many other issues that people are facing in the dairy industry.
Entonces, justicia migrante, los trabajadores lecheros, ¿verdad? Como tuvimos que buscar una solución y esto fue conocer el modelo WSR a través de la conexión con los trabajadores del tomate en Immokalee, quienes han sido los pioneros del programa o del modelo WSR y nosotros adaptamos esto a la lechería.
And so as an organization, we began to look for solutions to these issues. And that led us to this model of worker-driven social responsibility. And we connected with the organization, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida, who were the pioneers of this model. And so Migrant Justice then began to adapt it to the dairy industry.
Y la primera compañía que invitamos a formar parte del programa fue Ben & Jerry's, una compañía muy conocida, bueno, de Vermont y dentro de los programas de responsabilidad social. Entonces, pero invitar a Ben & Jerry's no fue cosa fácil. Fueron 3 años de campaña pública y negociación para que firmara el acuerdo de leche con dignidad.
So the first company that we joined, that we invited to join Milk with Dignity, was this very well-known local Vermont company called Ben & Jerry's that's really famous for their social responsibility. But it wasn't easy. It took 3 years of public campaigning to bring them to the table.
Pero el 3 de octubre del 2017 firmaron el acuerdo de leche con dignidad y este fue un momento histórico para los trabajadores lecheros de Vermont, sí, que tenían en la mesa un nuevo día.
But on October 3rd of 2017, Ben & Jerry's signed on to the Milk with Dignity agreement, and this became a really historic moment for dairy farm workers in Vermont, the beginning of a new day.
El programa de leche con dignidad cubre 260 trabajadores y representa un 20% de la industria lechera en Vermont y algunos ranchos en Nueva York.
The Milk with Dignity program in Ben & Jerry's supply chain covers 260 farm workers, and that represents about 20% of the dairy industry in Vermont, as well as a few farms in New York State.
Entonces ahora le vamos a compartir un video de testimonios directos de trabajadores bajo el programa Leche con Dignidad para que vean el impacto que ha tenido en las vidas de los trabajadores.
So now we're going to share a short video of testimonies from farm workers themselves who are on Milk with Dignity farms about the impact that this program has had.
Mi trabajo empezando pues nos levantamos a la mañana, llegamos, prendemos las máquinas, arreglamos todo, sacamos las vacas del corral, las metemos para ordeñar. O sea, es todo lo que se hace en un día normal, pero porque hay ranchos que trabajan de 12 horas corridas, le dan media hora de comida de las 12 horas, eso está más pesado.
¿Por qué es necesario? Porque es importante para nosotros como trabajadores, que salimos de nuestra casa para mejorar nuestras vidas, no para estar viviendo como te dijera, en condiciones que meramente ya no son humanas.
Pero sin el programa nosotros pues no nos aumentaban el sueldo y pues del día de descanso ni se hablara. No sabíamos qué derechos o qué podemos exigir nosotros como trabajadores.
Pues antes aquí no nos tomaban en cuenta como cuando nos enfermábamos. Ni nos llevaban al doctor y pues ese día lo teníamos que trabajar. Y si no lo trabajábamos, pues ese día pues, era descontado prácticamente. Y pues ahora bajo el programa de Derecho con Dignidad no lo trabajamos y pues aparte no nos pagan y pues ya los patrones no nos llevan al doctor. Y pues eso es muy importante para mí, para nosotros.
Bueno, se siente uno más protegido, porque ya sabe uno puede, o sea, ellos te orientan a lo que puede pasar, tus derechos que tú tienes como trabajador, el derecho que tienes, el respeto tanto de tu patrón, se siente uno más feliz, más protegido.
Si un día yo, por ejemplo, cuando voy a tirar cal en los grupos o hacer el agua de las patas, no tengo las mascarillas, los guantes, todo lo que necesito para que no me dañe mi salud, entonces ya el patrón tiene que acceder a comprar las cosas.
Ahora ya tenemos un día completo que antes no se tenía. Bueno, ahora que tengo mi bebé, pues ya pasamos más tiempo con ella, ya tenemos por lo menos un día para estar con ella todo el día. Se siente uno más seguro por todos los beneficios pues, y saber todos nuestros derechos.
Mediante el programa se ha hecho posible tener una casa nueva, porque antes estábamos en una traila que estábamos más amontonados. 2 personas en un cuarto, poco espacio. Entonces aquí la nueva vivienda pues ha cambiado demasiado porque todo es nuevo.
Hay algunas personas que le dan miedo para hablar con los dueños o exigirle algo que ocupan o cualquier cosa, ya sea porque pues tienen miedo porque los corran o algo así, los despidan del trabajo. Con el programa nos hace trabajar mejor, más a gusto, más en confianza con los dueños, sabiendo cuáles son nuestros derechos, o sea, de no ser humillado o decir o que te digan cosas que te ofendan. O sea, hay muchos ranchos que pasa eso y por el programa ya no puede pasar eso. Como los del rancheros también se benefician mucho por el programa. Así yo creo que ambos tienen un gran beneficio, como nosotros, un gran beneficio entre ambos.
Y para mí es muy importante que expanda el programa porque por eso el patrón le apoyan a él, pero también como nosotros como trabajadores tenemos esa voz de ya decir, sabes, quiero un día de descanso, quiero que hagas esto, y eso es algo necesario para cada trabajador, para que nosotros nos sintamos seguros en decir algo, no nos sintamos con miedo, sintamos la seguridad de decirle al patrón, sabes qué, quiero esto, y ya no tengamos tanto miedo a ellos.
Enrique, ¿quieres hablar un poquito de lo de Hannaford y ya de ahí pasamos?
Ok. Sí, sí, siempre me impacta este video. Pero bueno, Justicia Migrante seguimos organizando, ¿verdad? Porque necesitamos expandir estas protecciones del programa a más ranchos. Entonces ahora nosotros estamos llamando al supermercado Hannaford, un supermercado del noreste del país, para que se una al programa Leche con Dignidad.
This video always has a big impact on me. And so Migrant Justice is continuing to organize, to expand the Milk with Dignity program. And right now we're calling on the supermarket Hannaford, based across the Northeast, to join Milk with Dignity.
Entonces invitamos a todos y todas que están aquí presentes, a todos, para involucrarse, ¿verdad?, con Justicia Migrante y ayudarnos a traer a Hannaford a la mesa para que nos escuche e implemente el programa Leche con Dignidad. Así que pueden ir a nuestro sitio web como migrantjustice.net, donde pueden encontrar más información y hasta un toolkit de cómo pueden apoyarnos a nosotros los trabajadores.
So we invite you all who are here today to get involved and to join Migrant Justice and help us bring Hannaford to the table and to listen to farm workers and join Milk with Dignity. You can check out the Migrant Justice website, migrantjustice.net, to find more information. And we actually have a campaign, a Milk with Dignity toolkit there, which is a great resource.
Thank you, Enrique and Madeline. ¿Sí? ¿Está bien que siga?
Sí.
And the link, we actually put that link in the chat if anybody wants to click on it. So, what can institutions do to promote this model, this solution, to support workers? I know that our audience is really varied today. And so, you can sort of see what role you can play in this. But as Enrique mentioned, there are tangible ways and actionable steps that each of us can take to promote and defend the rights of workers. We personally see the role of buyers, of corporations, and in some cases, institutions such as universities, hospitals, maybe schools, as needing to say, yes, I want to stand with workers and put my market power to use in order to make my suppliers comply by legally committing themselves to programs that are worker driven. And in the case of corporations, giving up the power to dictate what solutions look like and giving their financial endorsement and participation in worker driven models. Institutions can recognize the influence and power that they do have on the market and begin conversations with organizations that are implementing these programs in order to find ways to support and expand these solutions, in order to guarantee a supply of goods that is rid of abuse and simultaneously empowers workers. We as a society, as consumers, as employers, owe this to workers. Especially in the past 2 years, workers have put their lives on the line for us to bring food and essential products to our table. And I personally think this is the bare minimum we can do. Next slide, Tania.
Rafaela. We're going to open it up to questions now. So if you have any questions for our speakers, please go ahead and enter them into the Q&A, or if you're more comfortable, you can do it in the chat too. Let's see. Britt, have you seen any questions coming through the chat yet? And while you're taking a quick look, I'd like to start with actually just reflecting a little bit on the time period that we're in. Obviously, we're all affected by COVID and this pandemic that we're in. And I'd really love to hear from our speakers about some of the ways that you think that workers in particular, farm workers, or other, if you want to comment on other food systems workers, but farm workers obviously is what we've been talking about. If there's certain ways that they've been affected in particular during the pandemic that is important for folks to understand. And any ways that you've worked, especially with Migrant Justice, on supporting workers through this.
¿Quieren contestar lo de COVID? Va.
Sí, sí, muchas gracias. Es muy buena pregunta. Pues nosotros en nuestro sitio web pueden encontrar un reporte de los primeros 2 años del programa y también como un adendum que hemos hecho del tercer año. En este adendum del tercer año es donde hablamos de cómo el programa Leche con Dignidad, por sus mecanismos, ha protegido los trabajadores durante la pandemia, porque el programa al inicio no fue pensando que iba a haber una pandemia, ¿no? Entonces, y para mencionar como, ¿verdad? Como una de las cosas que ha pasado durante la pandemia en la industria lechera es que patrones o rancheros han obligado a trabajadores a trabajar aún dando positivo a COVID. Entonces, esto ha hecho, ha hecho que durante la pandemia, trabajadores cuando sienten síntomas, mejor prefieren no avisar por miedo a represalia, ¿verdad? Y continúan trabajando. Con el programa Leche con Dignidad, los trabajadores han recibido, por ejemplo, equipo de protección, también las mejoras que han habido en la vivienda, que ya no haya muchas personas, 2 o 3 por cuarto, ha reducido la propagación también, ¿verdad? O protege en ese momento. Y sí, cuando un trabajador está enfermo, tiene la garantía de que tiene días pagados por enfermedad que pueden pedir y protección en contra de las represalias. Son algunas de las protecciones que provee el programa a los trabajadores.
Thank you. That's a great question. And something that we've been able to publish is a really comprehensive report about the last 2 years of the Milk with Dignity program, and then actually an addendum about the 3rd year of the program. And those reports are on our website, but they're really detailed explanation of how the program's been working. And specifically in the addendum, it talks about how workers have been protected during COVID. Even though we didn't create Milk with Dignity with this global pandemic in mind, the protections within the program have been really crucial. And something that we've seen happen during the pandemic is that farmers have been requiring, farmers outside of the Milk with Dignity program have been requiring workers to continue to work, even if they're sick. And so we've seen workers who end up going to work when they're having COVID symptoms and being afraid of losing their job. Whereas workers who are within the Milk with Dignity program are receiving the protections, things like personal protective equipment, also the improved housing conditions. Less crowding has been really crucial for helping stop community spread. And then also the fact that paid sick leave is provided means that when farm workers within the Milk with Dignity program get sick, they're able to stay home, they continue to be paid, and they don't have to worry about losing their job.
¿Quieren contestar la pregunta de si tienen un comentario del programa de Fair Trade USA de leche? O yo también puedo comentar, como quieras.
Dale, si quieres.
Como quieras.
¿Yo o tú? ¿Cuál era la pregunta?
La pregunta es si Leche con Dignidad ha tenido contacto con Giovanni, y la otra parte, que creo que es la más importante, es si hay un comentario, si tienes un comentario, tenemos un comentario acerca de la etiqueta de Fair Trade USA.
Sí, bueno, podemos comentar un poco y ya tú agregas.
Va.
Entonces, sí, nosotros tuvimos en alguna ocasión contacto con Giovanni con el interés de implementar leche con dignidad. Desgraciadamente no se pudo mover. Y aquí es donde, bueno, una cosa importante es saber que a la misma vez que los trabajadores estamos creando soluciones que sabemos que van a tener un impacto directo y donde nosotros tenemos voz, ¿verdad? Para cambiar las cosas. A la misma vez están creando programas que siguen siendo esta especie de solo como los checklists, ¿verdad? Y eso, por ejemplo, Fair Trade USA está creando su programa, ¿verdad? ¿Cómo es que se llama? No, bueno, puedes compartir quizás, Rafa, olvidé el nombre en inglés, pero sí, donde está dando una alternativa a compañías para evadir la responsabilidad y no crear realmente un cambio directo escuchando a los trabajadores de cuál es la solución.
So yes, we have had contact with the company Chobani. They approached us with interest in the Milk with Dignity program. And unfortunately, we weren't able to continue forward with that plan with them. But a really important thing to understand about this model is that workers need to be part of the solution. And so we see programs that are created that end up just being like a checklist or a checkbox for corporations to check off. And so that's something, an example of the Fair Trade USA dairy program. We see they're creating an alternative for companies, but that really doesn't provide the comprehensive protections and the leadership of workers.
For that, Rafaela, is there anything you want to add to that? This was Elizabeth's question in the Q&A box on, just to make sure everybody understood that whether Milk with Dignity had any contact from Chobani and any comments on the Fair Trade USA Fair Milk label.
Yes. So the Fair Trade Milk, I put some resources in the chat box regarding, there was an open letter that was sent from a lot of organizations that are ally organizations to Migrant Justice to Fair Trade USA, especially as Fair Trade USA claimed to have the first label the first program protecting workers in the dairy industry. It was like an innovative thing that they claimed to have. When in fact, as you can see, Migrant Justice was already doing that work through Milk with Dignity. And I mean, the only thing I would say is that like as consumers or as institutions, as folks that care about sustainability and protecting workers the right way, I think we need to just ask ourselves, like, who created that program? Like, who was behind that, let's say Fair Trade USA, and who is leading it, right? Like, is it workers leading it? Is it people that are experiencing what it's like to be a dairy worker on a daily basis versus a company, an organization that, for example, Fair Trade USA, like their model is companies want a label, right? Companies want something that shows the consumer, that makes them attracted to that product, that says this has this specific label. And so you can just, think a little more of like, what are the motivations of Fair Trade USA? And it's companies, they're there for companies. Whereas the Milk with Dignity program was first and foremost founded for workers, by workers. We think that is the way that all solutions to exploitations of workers should come from that, from the grassroots level, from workers. And I've not looked at all the questions. Let me look really quickly. Ash Richards right now.
I think you answered the main question.
I did. Okay.
Big questions about whether there were resources for language that can be used by food hubs or other partners who want to uphold the values that we're talking about in commitments with farms. Are there documents that can be accessed via Fair Food Program or Milk with Dignity websites? And you noted that there are, in fact, resources on both websites.
Yes.
Would you like to comment a little bit more about language and other steps that food hubs or other buyers can take in terms of trying to uphold and make sure that their suppliers are respecting workers and communicating with workers and providing the kind of resources that you've talked about?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would say I just put in the chat. I hope there's like, yeah, I think I put it. Oh no, I only put it to the panelists. Let me put it to everyone. Emailing me and I can connect you with like resources with our members, you know, with Migrant Justice and stuff, and give you more resources in terms of like what food hubs can do and other ways that, yeah, there can be increased pressure to implement these programs. I would also say that, you know, walking slowly in these spaces of solutions is my best advice. Like, instead of going like, we need to fix this now, and like, why don't we as a food hub, or why don't we just create a program that is worker driven? It's like, wait, have you talked to workers first? Have you connected with like a local organization that's organizing workers? Like, ask yourself that as an institution first. Is there something that already exists that might be really small, that might just need the support of institutions, might just need your financial and, let's say, capacity to expand, right? So kind of walking slowly, connecting with these organizations, right? If you live in the Northeast and you work in dairy peripherally and you hadn't heard of Migrant Justice, then like ask yourself why that is. Like, why are these not the spaces that workers are inhabiting? And how do you bring those existing organizations of workers to the table versus recreating something that's already existing? Also, I know we might not get to all the questions, so please, if there are questions that I'm not getting to, I think Ash Richards might have one, email me and I'm happy to talk outside of this webinar, definitely. As well as Ashley.
There's one more question, and that's from Christina Spach. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. Have there been any opportunities to date about leveraging institutional purchasing to support or expand worker-driven social responsibility programs like Work with Dignity? So yeah, do you have, especially Milk with Dignity is very focused on consumers and retail, I think. Has there been some thought about expanding to influence and have more specific asks for institutions?
Enrique, ¿quieres que conteste? No, sí, es que no, estás, okay. We've thought about it. I mean, there are, again, walking slowly, walking carefully around like what institutions can do. I think the critical piece is, and I would say like Milk with Dignity could work, let's say at UVM, right? If UVM committed to sourcing only from specific farms that were going to be monitored and audited through the Milk with Dignity program. I think there's like a false like, in my experience, universities at times can say like, oh, we don't have the power. We signed an agreement for 10 years saying that we're going to source this way or that way. But those agreements and contracts get edited all the time, right? And so it's really thinking about like, do you have administration support behind you? Are there folks who are really thinking that we'll put our money into programs like this in terms of paying a higher price, right? Like Ben & Jerry's pays a premium for that milk that is through Milk with Dignity, right? And that offsets the cost of compliance, because currently, right, like dairy farmers are pressured from companies to then cut costs in labor. And so you need to increase that, the cost that you're willing to give farmers and farm workers, for that matter, for that product. And so I would say it's complicated to ask institutions to do it, but it is a financial decision, right? A university would have to give more money into that budget, right, to source ethically through these programs. Without that type of commitment, I think it's really hard to ask farmers who are, you know, that second tier in that supply chain to change the day-to-day lives of workers when they're not being given more money to do that. I know I didn't answer it like fully to your question, but I think, yeah, I think it's money. I think it's legal commitments. I think it's making sure you have the right people with power at the table who are willing to say, I'll change the contract that we currently have with the way that we source our food. Enrique, ¿sí? ¿Quieres agregar algo?
Yeah, we can add that, yeah, right now the Ben & Jerry's, the first company that signed on, was really like a consumer campaign, and Hannaford right now is focused on Hannaford. But the farm worker leadership team of the organization is constantly trying to do more analysis and understand the industry and how to expand local dignity. And so we've been looking at ways to potentially do that through the state, through K through 12 contracts with dairy buyers, or with dairy retailers rather, and also thinking about other institutions like hospitals. And then, like Rafael was saying, working with universities and colleges that are also big consumers of dairy in Vermont and beyond. So there's definitely a lot of potential there for a more institutional based campaign, either after Hannaford, or it could be at the same time. We're constantly trying to like strategize and figure out how to effectively expand.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Enrique. Thank you, Madeline. Thank you, Rafaela. I think there's some great comments happening in the chat, and it's such a complex conversation, right? Because changing supply chains and changing what happens through supply chains there's a lot of different ways to affect change, and there's a lot of different challenges and barriers in the way. And so there's so much to unpack here. I really appreciate all of you who are also adding your own comments and thoughts. It's wonderful. And I really hope we keep this conversation going. I would also just add for contract help, we do have something called the Food Service Toolkit on FINE's website, which is a very useful document for helping advocate for contract language that promotes your values in your sourcing if you're at an institution. And it's useful for folks at a number of different levels. So I encourage people to check that out if you're thinking about contracts being one of those barriers addressing. And also there were some comments in the chat about sort of trying to figure out how, as a buyer, you can influence multiple farms who are all with the same conditions. And one thing we've seen work in other areas is pre-competitive platforms where multiple buyers talk about those values and what they want to see. It's totally a doable option to think about things like that, and finding ways to bring voices together to elevate these issues and to bring workers into that, so that that is centered in all of these conversations too. So with that, again, I just want to say thank you to everybody for joining us today. It's a really important topic, and I hope we keep digging into it together. And I also want to thank our speakers for bringing their expertise and all of their wonderful resources into this, for continuing to bring these issues to all of us, but also to continue to really bring it out through their work and through all the things that you're doing. So thank you. I would like to just end briefly with a couple of quick things. Thanks again for participating in the Q&A. We do have another webinar coming up soon. It's on February 9th. It's with the USDA with their National Agricultural Library folks. This is a huge online resource full of all kinds of useful resources. And whether you are a farmer struggling with certification, or you're a nonprofit looking for funding, if you're a researcher trying to find out more information about the topic you're interested in, there's a wealth of resources. And a couple of staff from the library are going to walk us through how to access those resources and understand what's there and available. So I hope you'll join us. That's February 9th from 2 to 3 p.m. Also, there are lots of ways to continue having this conversation or others. We have a dining operators listserv so for those of you who are calling from institutions and work in dining services or in support of them, that's a great opportunity to have peer-to-peer conversations about what's working, what's not, other resources that might be useful. We have a Facebook group where we welcome lots of dialogue and resource sharing as well. And of course, we're always interested in hearing more from you with your ideas, ways that we can help bring these conversations out and into places where they need to be. So I welcome that. You can email me or you can connect with FINE. You'll see lots of ways to do that. And then finally, there's also the opportunity through our webinar survey, which I've now mentioned a couple times, but it would be great if you take a moment to fill that out for us. Share any ideas you have. platforms that work, topics you want to see, speakers you'd like to hear from, any of that, we'd be happy to help facilitate. So with that, I'd like to again say thank you so much. Gracias to Enrique, to Rafaela, and to Madeline for helping translate as well and to provide more information about migrant justice and what you're doing. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Have a good day. See you.
Goodbye. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.
Muchas gracias.
Thanks so much.